Please join me in prayer. Put a hand on our shoulder and point us in the right direction. Put our hand on someone's shoulder and let it matter. Amen. Theologian Peter Rollins once told a parable about a world-renowned philosopher who, from an early age, set himself the task of proving once and for all that God doesn't exist. Of course, writes Rollins, such a task was immense, for the various arguments for and against the existence of God had done battle over the ages without either being able to claim complete victory. The philosopher was, however, a genius without equal, and he possessed a singular vision that drove him to work each day and long into every night in order to understand the intricacies of every debate, every discussion, and every significant work on the subject. The philosopher's project began to earn him respect among his fellow professors when, as a young man, he published the first volume of what would turn out to be a finely honed, painstakingly researched, encyclopedic masterpiece on the subject of God. The first volume of this work argued persuasively that the various ideas of God that had been expressed throughout antiquity were philosophically incoherent and logically flawed. As each new volume appeared, he offered time and again devastating critiques of the theological ideas that had been held through different periods of history. In his early 40s, he completed the last volume, which brought him to the present day. However, Rollins continues, the completion of this work did not satisfy him. He still had not found a convincing argument that would demonstrate once and for all the non-existence of God. For all he had shown was that all the notions of God up to that time had been problematic. So he spent another 16 years researching arguments and interrogating them with a highly nuanced, logical analysis. But by now he was in his late 50s and had slowly begun to despair of ever completing his life project. Then late one evening, while he was locked away in his study, bent wearily over his old oak desk, surrounded by a vast sea of books, he felt a deep stillness descend upon the room. As he sat there motionless, everything around him seemed to radiate an inexpressible light and warmth. Then deep in his heart he heard the voice of God address him. "Dear friend," said God, "the task you have set yourself is a futile one. I've watched all these years as you poured your being into this endless task. Yet you fail to understand that your project can be brought to completion only with my help. Your dedication and single-mindedness have not gone unnoticed, and they've won my respect," said God. "As a result, I will tell you a sacred secret. Dear friend, I do not exist." Then all of a sudden, everything appeared as it was before, and the philosopher was left sitting at his desk with a deep smile breaking across his face. He put his pen away, left his study, and never returned. Instead, in gratitude to God for helping him complete his lifelong project of proving God's non-existence, he dedicated his remaining years to helping the poor. This story is told by Peter Rollins with tongue in cheek and with a biting sense of situational irony. What we expect when listening to this story is that God's speaking will prove once and for all that God exists. Instead, God says to the philosopher, "I do not exist." Of course, it's God who says this to the philosopher. But below the surface irony, there's a deeper meaning to this story. And here's how Peter Rollins puts it. Just as belief in God is always a belief in a certain concept of God, he says, so the rejection of God is the rejection of one or more concepts of God. As one could ask the believer, "What God do you believe in?" writes Rollins, so one could ask the non-believer, "What God do you not believe in?" God, says Rollins, is not an object out there that we can dispassionately reflect upon and believe in or not. Instead, he says, God is like light. Just as the light in the room cannot be seen, but rather allows us to see, so God is not directly experienced, but rather is the name we give to a whole new way of experiencing. I wanted to begin this Easter sermon by troubling the notion of belief, because the Easter stories in the New Testament Gospels trouble the notion of belief. Believing in resurrection is not the first reaction of any of those first witnesses to the empty tomb. The first witnesses are instead confused and perplexed, disoriented, unsettled, disturbed. And slowly over time, Easter becomes for them a whole new way of experiencing the world, to borrow again from Peter Rollins. Today we heard John's version of the Easter story, which is different from the versions we find in the other New Testament Gospels, the Easter stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark's version of Easter is the shortest, just 8 verses. In that story, 3 women approach the tomb and discover it open. And when they peer inside, they see an angel who tells them that Jesus has been raised. Mark's Easter story ends abruptly, with the women saying nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Matthew's version of Easter speaks of 2 women, not 3, approaching the tomb. And as they draw near, according to Matthew, an angel descends from heaven to roll the stone in front of the tomb away as the ground quakes. The women flee and meet Jesus and then tell the other disciples what they saw. Luke's version of Easter doesn't specify how many women peered into the tomb, but Luke says there were 2 angels, not 1, who announced the resurrection to the women. And when the women told the disciples, says Luke, Peter ran to see the empty tomb for himself. John's version of Easter, today's gospel reading, says only 1 woman approached the tomb, Mary Magdalene. And John doesn't speak of an angel or of 2 angels being present when Mary first peers inside. It's just Mary who sees the empty tomb and then races to tell the other disciples. Then, says John, Peter and another disciple. Some say the other disciple was the very author of John's gospel. They run to see for themselves. And both disciples then went home perplexed, says John, while Mary Magdalene, who ran with them, stayed behind by the tomb, weeping. And when she looked inside again, she saw 2 angels sitting there, keeping vigil. These Easter stories disagree on details and on the order of events, disagree about the number of women, the number of angels, how many disciples actually looked inside the tomb, but they all agree that the tomb was empty. And they all agree that women were the first witnesses on Easter morning. And they all agree that belief was not the first reaction of anyone, with the exception of 1 disciple who is said to have simply believed that the tomb was empty. Instead of belief, everyone who peered inside the tomb, according to the stories, was confused and afraid, disoriented, unsettled, disturbed, overwhelmed. But what has always perplexed me as I read John's Easter story is why this version focuses so intently on Mary Magdalene. Only John tells of a special meeting between Jesus and Mary in a garden near the tomb where Mary mistakes the resurrected Christ for the gardener. Only John preserves an intimate conversation between Jesus and Mary, where Mary, upon recognizing that it is Jesus, grabs hold of him and embraces him. And only in John is Mary Magdalene the first and only witness to have seen the resurrected Christ. She is, according to John, the first Christian preacher, announcing the good news to everyone else. But why Mary? Let me get wonky for a second. Christian history and even some recent films have speculated that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute before becoming a follower of Jesus. The evidence for this is thin and circumstantial, but is based on two stories in the Gospels about women anointing the feet of Jesus and wiping his feet clean with their hair. Earlier in John's Gospel, Mary poured costly ointment all over Jesus' feet and used her hair to dry them. Luke's Gospel preserves a different version of this story. In Luke, Jesus is at a dinner party when, says Luke, an unnamed woman of the city, a euphemism for prostitute, entered the dining room, knelt down in front of Jesus, and washed his feet with her tears and her hair. Onlookers in both stories were appalled that Jesus would permit this. But in both stories, Jesus defends the women, and to the weeping prostitute he says, "You are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." The film Passion of the Christ takes this connection between Mary Magdalene and the woman of the city a step further and portrays Mary as the woman caught in adultery from John's Gospel. The woman who, says John, was thrown down into the dust before Jesus by her accusers who intended to stone her to death. But Jesus stands between the accusers and Mary in the film, defending her and calling them out as hypocrites for condemning her when they themselves were sinners too. John's Gospel preserves the timeless words of Jesus. "Let the one without sin cast the first stone." And hearing this, the humbled men dropped their stones one by one and drifted away. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Mary Magdalene had indeed been a woman of the city, and that she was indeed, as the film Passion of the Christ says, the woman whom Jesus defended before her accusers. Maybe it was her checkered past, her cross past, her crucifixion past, the skeletons in her closet that caused her to linger by the empty tomb. Maybe she lingered because Jesus had treated her differently than the other men had in her life. He treated her as a precious human being and not as an object to be exploited. Maybe she lingered because Jesus had told her she was accepted and beloved and forgiven and not defined by the crosses of her past, that she was God's child, regardless of what she'd done, that she mattered, that she belonged. Maybe John's version of Easter puts Mary front and center to hammer home the point that Easter is something to be experienced, that Easter was experienced in the life of Mary Magdalene, a broken person, broken like all of us, a broken person whose past skeletons were brushed aside by Jesus, who accepted her and blessed her and embraced her as God's child in spite of her past. Maybe Mary lingers in John's story as a statement to all of us with checkered pasts and skeletons in our closets. We who may have done things or said things or tried things that we now wish we could undo or unsay or untry. Maybe Mary lingers as a statement, as a witness, as a testimony that, yes, Easter is for everyone with a cross or with crosses in their past. And maybe she lingers as a testimony that Christ's life and death and resurrection is God's way of saying that everyone matters, everyone is accepted, everyone belongs, long before they can say the words, "I believe." In her book, Inspired, Rachel Held Evans tells of a conference she put together in 2015 to answer one question: why Christian? Why, she asks, with all the atrocities past and present committed in God's name, amid all the divisions ripping apart the church, in spite of all the doubts and frustrations and fears about faith, why are people still followers of Jesus? We were a diverse group at the conference, she writes, evangelical and Lutheran, Baptist and Episcopalian, Latina and black and white and Indian and Korean, high church and low church, Catholic and Protestant, Reformed and Methodist, straight and gay and bisexual and transgender, pastors and scholars, writers and activists, crunchy, dreadlocked mamas, tattooed and foul-mouthed priests, sweet-talking Southerners, and stiletto-boasting fashionistas. Looking at us from the outside, you'd have no idea what we all had in common. Held Evans continues, each speaker approached the microphone to share their stories and answer the why Christian question. I am a Christian, explained Episcopal priest Curlin Richter, because having a body wasn't always good news for me. But then I met good news that had a resurrected body. In Jesus, I met a God who spits and kisses, who yells and cries. I am a messy and embodied person, and this is a messy and embodied faith. I am a Christian, declared Austin Channing Brown, an author and activist whose work focuses on racial justice in the church. I am a Christian because God knows my pain, not in any abstract way, but in a real, bloody, and fleshed way. I am a Christian, said Rachel Murr, a researcher and counselor, because the gospel is good news for queer people like me, too. I'm a Christian, explained Baptist preacher and human rights activist Allison Robinson, because I don't always know if this story is true, but I choose to live my life as if it were. I choose to live as if the things Jesus died for were worthy of God's sacrifice and therefore worthy of mine. When it came time for me to share, said Rachel Held Evans, I spoke honestly about my doubts about the Bible and Christianity. I confessed my uncertainties about raising children in this broken and beloved community we call the church. I explained how gatherings like this conference help restore my faith because they pull me out of my head and into the lives of others, into the big, colorful, messy, and magical story of Jesus. I am a Christian, I concluded, because the story of Jesus is still the story I am willing to risk being wrong about. Maybe we all linger by the empty tomb each Easter, linger like Mary Magdalene did so long ago, because the Easter story not only offers a whole new way of seeing the world, to modify those words of Peter Rollins, but maybe we linger by the tomb because Easter offers a whole new way of seeing ourselves as beloved and as belonging to God and to the church long before we can ever say the words, I believe. Amen.